Long before the sun rose on November 27th, 1810, a lone chimney sweep stood on the doorstep of 54 Berners Street, a respectable house just north of the bustle of Oxford Street. The home belonged to Mrs. Tottenham, a wealthy widow of good social standing. A maid, roused from her sleep, answered the door, no doubt annoyed by the 5 a.m. call. The chimney sweep insisted he'd been summoned, and the maid, equally insistent that he had not, sent him on his way. But moments later, there was another knock, and another chimney sweep, and another. Before the hour was out, a dozen bewildered sweeps had been turned away from the quiet residence, each claiming to have been hired for a job that didn't exist. This was not a simple mix-up. It was the opening salvo in one of the most audacious, elaborate, and disruptive practical jokes in history. An event that would bring a sizable portion of London to a grinding halt and transform a quiet address into the most talked-about property in the city. It was an assault by 1,000 sources, a masterpiece of mischief that left the city asking two simple questions. Who was tormenting Mrs. Tottenham, and why? But this story has also left historians questioning whether the Berners Street hoax, as it came to be known, was itself a much larger hoax played out over history rather than a single day. The day-long siege of 54 Berners Street was a masterclass in escalating chaos, a meticulously orchestrated performance that unfolded in distinct, increasingly frantic acts. The perpetrator didn't just cause a momentary disruption. They waged a campaign of logistical prank fare against an unsuspecting household and, by extension, the city itself. This wasn't a spontaneous prank. It was the result of 6 weeks of careful planning, during which anywhere up to 4,000 letters were dispatched across London. Each was designed to lure its recipient to the same address on the same day, at carefully paced out times throughout that day. The letters weren't generic, and each one was cleverly tailored to their targets, using specific and believable pretexts to ensure maximum participation. For tradesmen, it was a simple order. For dignitaries, it was a matter of civic or national importance. But for Mrs. Tottenham, the individual who was on the receiving end of this affair, it was a waking nightmare. After the initial confusion of the chimney sweeps, the assault on Berners Street intensified. The first rays of dawn brought with them dozens of coal wagons, their drivers having hauled their cargo from the Paddington wharves, only to be told their delivery was unwanted. They were followed in quick succession by a parade of bakers, each carrying elaborate, expensive wedding cakes. These were then followed by a series of bootmakers and shoemakers, all of whom were equally perplexed and frustrated. The quiet residential street was rapidly turning into a chaotic marketplace, the growing crowd of duped tradesmen mixing with curious onlookers. As the morning progressed, the scale of the hoax grew to truly epic proportions. The deliveries became larger, more expensive, and more absurd. Over a dozen finely crafted pianos arrived from different suppliers, creating a logistical impossibility on the increasingly crowded street. They were soon joined by a massive partial church organ that required 6 strong men to carry it. Carts laden with furniture, linens, jewelry, and glassware tried to navigate the chaos. The sheer volume of food orders was staggering. 40 butchers arrived, each bearing a leg of mutton. 40 fishmongers appeared with lobsters and cod. 50 different pastry chefs attempted to deliver a combined total of 2,500 raspberry tarts. Reportedly, the food started rotting, though thankfully this event didn't occur in the summer. At the same time, a steady stream of professionals began to arrive, summoned by notes crafted with cunning psychological insight. Doctors, surgeons, and apothecaries were told someone at the address was gravely ill, while vicars and priests were summoned to minister to a dying soul. Lawyers were led to believe their presence was required for an urgent legal matter, and dancing teachers were invited to give lessons to Mrs. Tottenham's daughters. The most disturbing arrival was an undertaker, who appeared with a coffin built to Mrs. Tottenham's specific measurements. The prankster's ambition extended to the highest echelons of London society. As the chaos on Berners Street reached its peak, it also began to attract some of the most powerful men in the country, and given the time, the world. The governor of the Bank of England and the chairman of the East India Company were lured to the house by letters hinting at a massive fraud they needed to investigate. The Duke of Gloucester, a member of the royal family, was summoned to the supposed deathbed of a loyal family retainer. The Lord Mayor of London arrived in his full regalia and official carriage, drawn by a letter claiming Mrs. Tottenham was on her deathbed and wished to give a sworn deposition. By the time he arrived, the street was so impassable that he could not stop and was forced to drive directly to the nearest magistrate's office to demand action. By mid-afternoon, Berners Street and the surrounding neighborhood were in complete gridlock. The narrow street was a quagmire of wagons, carts, angry tradesmen, and gawking crowds. Fights broke out among the frustrated merchants, many of whom demanded payment for their goods and wasted time. Perishable items were ruined, and fragile goods were smashed between the crush of people in the area, and pickpockets and other thieves began to descend on the crowds. The authorities were powerless, and a party of cops were dispatched from the Marlborough Street police office, only to find themselves utterly overwhelmed. Their only recourse was to block off both ends of the street, but this did little to stem the tide, as people continued to arrive on foot for their appointments. The final, cruelest twist came at 5 p.m., when a large crowd of domestic servants descended on the house, each clutching a letter promising them an interview for a position in the household. It wasn't until long after dark that the stream of visitors finally ceased and the exhausted crowds dispersed, leaving behind a scene of chaos and confusion. The consensus, both at the time and in the centuries since, points to one man as the architect of this grand deception: Theodore Edward Hooke. At 22 years old, Hooke was already a well-known figure in London, a celebrated intellectual, a successful playwright, and a well-known practical joker. Born the son of a popular composer, Hooke was a precocious talent who found success at just 16 while writing comic operas. He spent a brief and unremarkable time at Harrow and Oxford, where he was noted more for his mischief than his studies. He possessed a legendary gift for improvising witty, satirical songs on the spot, a talent so remarkable it charmed the future King George IV. And just to give some context here, this was during the time when George was Prince Regent for his father, who had been completely incapacitated from mental illness. For all intents and purposes, Hooke had made himself a favorite of the king. Hooke never faced official punishment for the Berners Street hoax. Immediately after the event, he thought it wise to leave London for a few weeks. Though he was widely suspected, no one could prove his involvement. It wasn't until 25 years later, in his 1835 semi-autobiographical novel, Gilbert Gurney, that he finally confessed, to a certain degree. His protagonist, a character based on Hooke himself, confessed to the Berners Street hoax in the course of the novel. Notably, it has been suggested that this was simply one more element of the prank, and that this indirect confession was just his way of causing additional confusion. For all the chaos it caused, the motive behind the Berners Street hoax remains a complete mystery. The most popular and enduring explanation is as simple as it gets. It was all for a bet, though this tale has never actually been confirmed. The story goes that one day in November 1810, Hooke was walking down Berners Street with his friend, the architect and writer Samuel Beasley. Pointing to the neat, quiet house at number 54, Hooke made a seemingly spontaneous wager. He bet a hilariously small sum, the modern equivalent of 100 pounds, that he could make that random dwelling the most famous and talked about address in all of London within a week. Beasley took the bet, and a few days later, he stood across the street and watched the pandemonium unfold before handing over the money to his triumphant friend. The victim of this wager was Mrs. Tottenham, a well-to-do widow who, by most accounts, was a complete stranger to Hook. The dominant theory holds that she and her house were chosen entirely at random. Under this theory, it was selected only for their location on a respectable street where, crucially, a room could be rented directly opposite to serve as an observation post. Notably, some later accounts hinted at a pre-existing grudge between Hook and Mrs. Tottenham, suggesting the hoax was an act of personal revenge. Under this theory, Hook essentially covered up his harassment of his enemy on the basis that, hey, it's just a prank, bro. Lighten up. In the immediate aftermath, the Berners Street hoax was the talk of London. The public reaction was a mixture of amusement and outrage. The duped tradesmen and dignitaries were furious, and newspapers condemned the party responsible. There were significant calls for the perpetrator to be found and forced to make financial restitution for the damage caused. A reward was offered for information, but Hook's identity remained a secret, and he was never punished. Ultimately, of course, if this event did happen as history records it, it's hard to think of this as anything other than a cruel prank primarily on the working class of London. While the wealthy were also pranked, they simply moved on with their day feeling a little humiliated. The working class people who brought out their perishable goods suffered more than anyone, and ultimately never received any compensation. Yet, there is one final, tantalizing twist to the tale. Some historians have suggested that the hoax itself was the hoax, or at least that the event was wildly exaggerated by the press with Hook's encouragement. In this view, Hook's true genius was not in orchestrating the chaos, but in convincing the world that it had happened on such a grand scale. Under this theory, the Berners Street hoax was orders of magnitude less grand than the newspapers reported. This narrative accepts that Hook did indeed put on a small event, but denies that it could have possibly been as large as suggested. Hook then used his significant influence within high society to route false information to the owners of newspapers, who ran wild with the story. This is plausible after all, since Hook had strong connections all the way up to the Prince Regent of the United Kingdom. If true, his greatest prank wasn't on poor Mrs. Tottenham and the people of London, but on the newspapers, the public, and history itself. Whether real or exaggerated, the story's legacy is undeniable. Notably, the Berners Street hoax has been called a direct ancestor of swatting. This is the modern and far more dangerous practice of making a false emergency call to dispatch the cops to a victim's home. Others have compared it to modern internet trolls ordering multiple pizzas to the house of someone who has been doxxed. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to like and subscribe and to share this video. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership to support my work further. On a weekend in mid-September 1971, a quiet branch of Lloyd's Bank on Baker Street in London became the scene of what's been called the most audacious bank heist in history. And trust me when I say it, this is a heist where the more you look into it, the more questions and mysteries there are. A gang of thieves spent that weekend tunneling into the bank's vault and emptying the contents of hundreds of safety deposit boxes. By the time dawn broke on Monday, the burglars had vanished with valuables worth an estimated £3 million, unadjusted for inflation, as well as potentially invaluable state secrets. Adjusting for inflation, that's worth £54 million today, or a staggering $70 million, making it one of the most high-stakes heists in history. The plan to break into the Baker Street Bank vault, was conceived by a 38-year-old career criminal named Anthony Gavin. Gavin's inspiration reportedly came from an unlikely source, a Sherlock Holmes story called The Red-Headed League, in which criminals tunnel into a bank vault from a nearby cellar. Taking a page from fiction, Gavin assembled a crew and set out to turn the literary plot into reality. He enlisted several accomplices, including Reg Tucker, a car salesman who, importantly, had no criminal record, and Thomas Stevens, who helped procure the tunneling equipment. Gavin's crew also included an older associate, Benjamin Wolfe, who would play a key role in securing the gang's access to the target. In December 1970, under Gavin's direction, Reg Tucker posed as a respectable businessman and opened an account at the Lloyd's branch under a false name. A couple of months later, Tucker rented a safety deposit box at the bank, which gave him regular access to the vault area. During each visit, Tucker carefully surveyed the vault. He carried an umbrella to discreetly measure the room's dimensions and noted the placement of furniture and security features. Over 13 visits, he effectively mapped out the vault's layout for the crew. Meanwhile, Stevens gathered the tools they would need for a subterranean break-in. This was no amateur job. He got them access to a 100-ton hydraulic jack, a thermal lance, and a truly massive stash of explosives. All the pieces of the plan were coming together. The burglars just needed a way under the bank without attracting attention. Opportunity knocked in May 1971 when a leather goods shop 2 doors down from the bank, named Lissac, went out of business. And yeah, you don't have to rewind here. The business was actually called Lissac. The vacant shop had a basement that the gang believed aligned perfectly with the bank vault just 40 feet away. Through an associate, Gavin arranged for Benjamin Wolfe, who was 64 years old and aroused little suspicion, to lease the shuttered shop for £10,000. Crucially, Wolfe made a mistake that would later cost the gang. He signed the lease in his own name instead of a fake name. And to drop perhaps my favorite Simpsons reference of all time, boy, I really hope somebody got fired for that blunder. With Wolfe securing the premises at 189 Baker Street and the bank located at 187, the crew now had their forward base of operations. Under the cover of a seemingly innocent shop, they could begin the dirty work of digging a tunnel toward the bank's vault. Notably because the storefront appeared to be undergoing renovations, the equipment that was flowing into the leased building raised no suspicions whatsoever at the time. The crew's planning even took into account the bank's subterranean alarm system. The Lloyd's branch was equipped with sensors designed to detect vibrations from drilling or tunneling. In late summer 1971, however, roadwork in the area had been causing frequent false alarms, prompting the bank to switch off the system until the construction was finished. Gavin's crew learned of this vulnerability and seized the moment, which honestly, much like everything with this heist, is quite frankly brilliant. By early September, with alarms disabled and the shop in their control, the burglars were ready to strike. They prepared to execute their plan over a weekend, when the bank would be closed and their tunneling noises less likely to draw attention. Late on Friday, September 10th, 1971, the gang put their plan into motion. Under cover of darkness, they descended from Lissac and began their mission to penetrate the vault. Over the preceding weeks, they had quietly excavated a horizontal shaft about 30 feet long, using picks and shovels and shoring it up as they went. I'll leave it up to everyone in the comments to make the jokes here, because damn, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. More than 8 tons of soil were removed and stashed within the Lissac basement as the tunnel advanced. By that Friday night, the tunnel had reached directly under the bank's vault floor. The burglars now faced their final obstacle: 91 centimeters of steel-reinforced concrete at the vault's base. Inside the narrow tunnel, Gavin's team set to work on the vault floor. First, they tried using the heavy jack to force a crack in the concrete, but the slab would not yield. Next, they deployed the thermal lance, hoping the torch could cut through metal and stone. Again, the vault's construction proved too formidable. With time slipping away, the crew resorted to their last option: explosives. They packed the tunnel ceiling and coordinated the detonation with the noise of traffic above to mask the blast. The explosion was risky. It could have buried the thieves alive or alerted the authorities, but luck was on their side. Finally, the blast punched a jagged hole through the vault floor, finally giving the burglars access. Around midnight, they breached the vault and climbed up into the bank's inner sanctum. Once inside the vault, the thieves sprang into action. The Lloyd's branch contained hundreds of safety deposit boxes belonging to private clients, and the gang had the entire weekend to loot as many as possible. There were 268 boxes in total, and the burglars cracked open most of them one by one. The treasure trove inside was eclectic and ranged from cash to jewelry to gold to stock and bond certificates, and even rare wine. For fans of Tolkien like myself, I essentially like to think of this as a real-life Smaug's hoard. For those of you who aren't Tolkien fans, this is the dragon that was hoarding immense amounts of gold and valuables in The Hobbit. Over the course of the looting, they reportedly drank rare wine they found in one of the bank boxes, perhaps to keep their spirits up. The crew hadn't left anything to chance, and they kept a lookout on a rooftop near the bank while the looting occurred. The crew used walkie-talkies to stay in contact between the tunnel, vault, and the roof. Unbeknownst to them, however, these radio transmissions would be their Achilles' heel. Around 11 p.m. on Saturday night, a local amateur radio enthusiast named Robert Rowlands was tinkering with his equipment at home. While he was tinkering away, he accidentally intercepted odd chatter on the airwaves. To his astonishment, he realized he was listening to a crime in progress. He heard voices discussing drilling, explosives, and, quote, getting into the vault. And yeah, for all the genius behind their heist, they probably should have used some sort of basic coded language. How hard would it be to say something like, "The hot dog is in the bun," when they got into the vault, instead of, "Hey, we just drilled and exploded our way into the bank vault"? Recognizing the seriousness of what he'd heard, Rowlands called the police to report that he was eavesdropping on a bank robbery in real time. When Rowlands first phoned the police, the officers on duty were skeptical of his bizarre story. They suggested he keep listening and record the criminal's conversation, then call back, which, reading between the lines, seems to have been their polite way of dismissing his concerns. But Rowlands didn't take the hint and kept listening in. Using a cassette recorder, he captured several minutes of the thieves' voices echoing over the radio. Early on Sunday, at about 2 a.m., he contacted Scotland Yard directly and played back the tape. This time, the police took him seriously, and senior officers mobilized an urgent search, realizing they had a rare chance to catch a major heist in progress. Scotland Yard alerted police across central London and began checking local bank vaults one by one. By Sunday morning, dozens of officers were scrambling to locate a break-in they knew was happening. All that said, they had scant information on where exactly the heist was going down. The robbers' communications gave no clear location, and there were many banks within the range of Rowlands' radio set. Over 100 officers and detectives were pulled into the effort, with some 750 bank branches in an 8-mile radius to inspect. It was a race against time, and incredibly, the authorities came within a cat's whisker of catching Gavin's crew red-handed. At mid-afternoon on Sunday, September 12th, 2 police officers arrived at 185 Baker Street, the Lloyd's branch, as part of the canvass of area banks. They stood outside the vault door, tested it, but from the outside everything appeared normal. The thick door was closed and intact, and no alarms or sensors had been triggered. Hearing nothing out of the ordinary, the officers moved on to the next bank on their list, not realizing that just behind that secure door, Gavin and his team were hiding silently. Inside the vault, the thieves heard the police inspection and held their breaths. Once the footsteps faded, they presumably breathed a massive collective sigh of relief. The burglars knew they had narrowly escaped capture, but remarkably, rather than stopping there, the crew continued. And I suppose if you have the sort of personality that allows you to pull off the most audacious heist in history, you're not going to let a little thing like almost being caught stop you. By Sunday evening, after about 30 hours of pillaging, the group had gathered as much loot as they could possibly handle. With Monday rapidly approaching, they decided it was time to pull out. The crew packed up their tools and bags of stolen valuables and exited the way they came. They crawled back through the tunnel into the Lissac basement, then locked up the shuttered storefront behind them. They vanished into the London night, hauling away one of the richest pulls in British history, leaving the bank remaining none the wiser until normal business hours resumed. When Lloyd's employees opened the branch on Monday morning, September 13th, they were greeted by a shocking scene. The vault's interior was ransacked, the safety deposit boxes pried open and strewn about, and there was a gaping hole blown through the concrete floor. Yeah, I'm going to say the Lloyd's bank manager may have had a serious case of the Mondays. Bank officials immediately alerted the police, and it didn't take long for investigators to connect the dots between this burglary and Rowlands's mysterious radio recordings. Scotland Yard launched a massive investigation, assigning over 100 detectives to the case. At first, the robbers seemed to have left few clues, but a couple of critical mistakes soon gave them away. The quick breakthrough came from old-fashioned police work. Detectives noted the tunnel led toward a recently rented shop nearby. Checking property records, they discovered that the lease for Lissac had been signed just months before by one Benjamin Wolfe. Old Mr. Wolfe, whose name was already familiar to them from criminal circles, had accidentally used his real name. Although Wolfe initially claimed he had simply sublet the shop and knew nothing of the crime, the police put him under surveillance. Around the same time, underworld informants passed along rumors about known tunnel-digging experts bragging of a big job, which pointed investigators toward Anthony Gavin. Within weeks, authorities had identified the core crew. They also learned that at least one woman had been involved in the operation, though her identity was not immediately known, and in fact never would be. On October 27, 1971, about 6 weeks after the robbery, police moved in and arrested Gavin, Tucker, Stevens, and Wolfe in coordinated raids. The men were charged and eventually faced trial for the Baker Street burglary. Facing strong evidence, including the recorded conversations from the walkie-talkie transmissions, the defendants pleaded guilty. In January 1973, Gavin, Tucker, and Stevens were each sentenced to 12 years in prison, a hefty penalty reflecting the unprecedented scale of the heist. Old Mr. Wolfe, perhaps due to his advanced age, his lesser role, or concerns about the potential to successfully prosecute, received an 8-year sentence. Justice, it seemed, had caught up with the criminal masterminds of the tunnel heist. However, not everyone involved in the Baker Street robbery was brought to justice. Several accomplices vanished before the police could catch them. Among those who got away was a well-known hoodlum known as Mickey Gervais. He was believed to have been part of the operation, possibly tasked with handling the alarm system, and perhaps providing a secondary lookout. Gervais and at least one unidentified woman who had been seen with the gang simply disappeared off the face of the earth after the heist. Despite an intensive manhunt that continued for years, no additional arrests were made beyond the original 4. Decades later, some of the heist's participants remain unidentified, and whatever share of the loot they took with them has never been recovered. Police managed to seize only about a tenth of the loot when they rounded up Gavin's crew. The rest vanished with the culprits who evaded capture. This had led some to speculate that this complex operation was actually orchestrated by a much larger, more significant power than the four who were ultimately held accountable. Many of the safety deposit box owners, when contacted, were extremely reluctant to detail what had been taken. In fact, a significant number of clients never came forward at all to claim losses. This has led to speculation that some boxes held illicit or sensitive items that the owners didn't want to admit to possessing. The mysterious gap between what was taken and what was reported stolen has fueled rumors that the gang might have stumbled upon far more than just money and jewels in that vault. In the weeks following the heist, wild rumors swirled about the true nature of the score. London newspapers hinted that a particular safety deposit box might have contained compromising photographs of Princess Margaret, the younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II. Princess Margaret had a reputation for a flamboyant private life and was known to socialize with a mix of high society figures and unlikely companions. One notorious acquaintance of hers was a gangster-turned-actor named John Bindon, and scandalous gossip suggested the two had been caught and photographed. According to the rumor, the burglars either knowingly or unknowingly stole explicit photographs of Margaret and Bindon. This material was so explosive that the British government purportedly slapped on a gag order to halt press coverage of the case. Other rumors suggested that they had obtained intelligence files on high-level British or foreign officials or dossiers on members of British high society. According to the rumors, these files may have contained extremely compromising materials on these powerful people. The British government has consistently denied these rumors, and no hard evidence of these rumored items has ever surfaced. Further fueling these rumors is the fact that a large portion of the government's file on the investigation has been placed under lock and key for a number of years. And I can already anticipate your follow-up question. They blocked all access to the records for a literal century, with the records scheduled to become public in 2071, which certainly does nothing to dispel the rumors. Picture a typical Saturday evening in southern England on November 26, 1977. Families are gathered around their television sets, or tellies to use the local lingo. The children are waiting for cartoons or some form of real entertainment, while their parents are watching the early evening news. At around 5:10, during a routine news report on Southern television, the picture wavers, and the broadcast is abruptly interrupted. The voice of the newsreader falls silent, overtaken by a crackling buzz. In its place comes a strange, distorted voice, calm but distinctly unnatural, echoing through living rooms across the region. This is the voice of Virillion, a representative of the Ashtar Galactic Command, the voice proclaims. For nearly 6 minutes, this mysterious presence delivers a message unlike anything heard on the evening news. It warns that humanity must renounce conflict and nukes and learn to live in peace to avoid some imminent disaster. The speaker talks of an upcoming Age of Aquarius and urges listeners to take heed, saying we have only a short time to turn away from conflict. The tone is polite but firm, at once soothing and spine-chilling. Many viewers feel a jolt of disbelief and a hint of fear. For those frozen minutes, an ordinary night becomes a scene from science fiction. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the eerie transmission stops. Normal programming resumes and the bizarre voice vanishes. Southern Television quickly apologizes for a technical fault, and the broadcast resumes as normal. In search of answers, investigators from the Independent Broadcasting Authority examined the transmission. They soon found evidence that someone hijacked the broadcast signal. Southern Television's network had a relay transmitter that picked up the station's feed over the air, rather than by secure landline, which made it vulnerable to interference. A clever intruder apparently exploited this weakness. By transmitting a powerful signal of their own at just the right frequency, they overrode the legitimate broadcast with the so-called Varillion message. Pulling off this feat would have required significant technical know-how and equipment. Despite extensive investigations, the perpetrators were never identified. Whoever orchestrated the hoax, assuming it was indeed one, left no trace and never stepped forward to confess. With the culprit a mystery, several theories emerged to explain the strange broadcast. One popular explanation is that it was indeed an elaborate hoax carried out by tech-savvy pranksters. In this scenario, a group of electronics enthusiasts or rogue broadcasters deliberately beamed out the fake alien message to see what would happen. They may have chosen the TV news hour for maximum impact, crafting the content to mimic sci-fi tropes, or to send a dramatic pro-peace statement. All the technical evidence supports the hoax theory. Everything that occurred could be achieved by human means, and similar signal intrusions have happened elsewhere, both before and after. Another theory takes the broadcast at face value. Perhaps some suggest it really was what it claimed to be, a message from an extraterrestrial intelligence. In the late 1970s, fascination with UFOs was widespread, and a number of viewers believed an alien or higher power might have genuinely cut into the broadcast to deliver an urgent warning. Believers in this theory thought an advanced civilization may have chosen this unconventional method to communicate. It sounds far-fetched to many, including myself, but this theory persists in UFO enthusiast circles. However, aside from the dramatic claim of the voice itself, no evidence supports an extraterrestrial origin. Investigators found nothing to suggest that the message came from anywhere other than a terrestrial transmitter. For most observers, the alien hypothesis, while intriguing, is not grounded in any verifiable facts. Yet another idea is that the incident was a secret government experiment or test. According to this theory, some government agency could have staged a fake alien broadcast to observe public reaction or to test emergency communications. It's conceivable that authorities in the Cold War era might have been curious about how citizens would respond to a sudden extraterrestrial scenario. Perhaps the message was a planned drill in psychological warfare or a test of how easily the media system could be infiltrated. This notion has been floated by conspiracy theorists, but it remains purely speculative. No official body has ever acknowledged anything of the sort. In fact, the broadcasting regulators themselves were clearly scrambling to find out what happened, which they likely would not have needed to do had it been an internally planned test. Without evidence or documentation, the secret experiment theory also remains an unsupported fringe idea. In the view of most people, the simplest theory, that human pranksters were behind the broadcast, remains by far the most convincing. There was nothing really groundbreaking in the Varillion signal intrusion, and it was pretty standard New Age talking points. Whether this was pranksters or some sort of massive social experiment is of course a much more interesting question, which remains an unsolved mystery at present.